So we can maybe, as I say, it's 5:34 now. We've given folks a few minutes to join, so perhaps we can get go ahead and get started. Is that okay, Tyler? Is that okay, guys?
That sounds great.
Okay, great. So first of all, I'm going to apologize for looking ridiculous because suddenly I'm having all of the hot flushes. It could very well be down to the fact that Rebecca is joining us, or it could just be down to that certain age that women of me reach, and women of my age reach and have to cope with all kinds of flushes. So I apologize for my fans and my wine and all the rest of it.
It's also just really hot out today.
I'm melting. Rebecca, I'm melting. Okay, so let's get started. I am so happy that you are joining us. As we've been noting for the last 8 weeks, it is a privilege and an honor to have Rebecca Makkai join us. She is a novelist of some renown. She has previously been on written a number of novels, including The Borrower and the 100-Year House, which I think is a ghost story. I've not read it, but I think it's partly a ghost story. Okay, as well as a collection of shorter stories, 4 stories called Music for Wartime. But her most recent novel, and I dare say this, is the one that has garnered a great deal of critical acclaim as well as popularity. And it is actually the novel that brought Rebecca to my attention. In late last year, I just happened to pick up a copy of The Great Believers. And the second that I started reading it, I fell in love with this book. It has won numerous awards, including the Stonewall Book Award, the LA Times Book Prize, as well as a whole host of others. But when I picked up, I was literally like a chapter into it when I contacted a friend of mine, Brian Hegelke of New City Magazine, and said, hey, do you know Rebecca? Because Brian is the knower of all things artistic in Chicago. And so I'm like, Brian, do you know Rebecca? And he's like, as a matter of fact, I do. And so he put us in touch over Christmas. Yeah. And honestly, since then, Rebecca, I have been recommending this book to absolutely everyone that will listen. I've been sending it out as gifts. It was part of my Christmas parcels and so on. It is a wonderful book. And it is, in my mind, it is a window into our history. Into a window into LGBTQ history, a window into LGBTQ acceptance, and I've been so deeply moved by it, and we'll talk more about the book and all of our reactions. But this book club has been, for the last 8 weeks, a complete lifeline to many of us. I've just loved it, and I'm going to hand it over to Kelly for a second because Kelly was one of the people that I asked, have you read this book? And she's like,
I know.
Introduced it to her and posted it to her, and that's how this book club came about. And Chicago House, you don't need any introduction, Rebecca, to Chicago House. I think it came up in your research a great deal, and we'll talk a bit more about that. But Kelly.
Yes, I'll just say, first of all, again, welcome, Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining us. And I am just absolutely thrilled to be in conversation with you tonight and Nabila and, as a matter of fact, all of our fellow book clubbers. And I remember when Nabila and Eric approached me about this idea for a virtual book club. Number one, I was just all in because I love reading, I love book clubs, and I like discussion, like really good discussion. And so when Nabila mentioned The Great Believers, and she's like, have you read this book, The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai? I have to say, as phenomenal as a book that it is, and it really is a phenomenal read, I had never heard of it. And I have to say, I was really surprised by that. But it really is a page turner. And I felt that from the very get-go, and I won't talk too long here, but from the very get-go, I was engaged and felt connected to the characters immediately, just immediately. And so you just have a beautiful way of writing. And just the characters are just fantastic. So I'm really excited about the conversation that we'll dive into tonight.
Yeah,
Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Here's what I have to say. I've learned, because this is my 4th book, and I have learned the only thing that really moves books, unless like Oprah, you know, whatever. The only thing that really moves books is friend-to-friend recommendations. That's it. You can get the best reviews in the world. You can be on NPR. NPR helps, you know, like they're all great. But if a book is really going to have legs, like long-term, it has to be people, because I'll read a book review and then I'll forget about it or whatever. But if a friend says, you personally need to read this book, that's what makes me read a book.
Yes.
And so I'm so grateful when people kind of adopt a book or even just recommend it to one friend. Like that is worth more, I swear, than being in Time Magazine or whatever.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah. My mom has told me 3 times, she's like, now Kelly, when you finish that book, you're going to give it to me, right? I want to read that book. And I say, yes, Mom, you told me. Yes, I'll get you the book. The Great Believers, it's coming.
There is, in my mind, and hand on my heart, I think it is going to be a genre-defining book. Mm-hmm. I think I heard an interview by you, or maybe I read it, that there was a lot written about the AIDS crisis in New York. There's a lot written about what happened on the West Coast.
Not enough, but a lot. Yes,
but a lot, right?
Yeah.
But there is a like very little written about the ground experience in Chicago. And Chicago was another center. So can you talk a little bit about how Chicago became, I mean, obviously you are a Chicago native, but how did Chicago become the focal point for this novel?
Yeah, I absolutely can. You know, I was feeling around the earliest days. I wasn't sure what the core of the book would be. I had this woman who'd been an artist's model, and I thought it was going to be more about her. The end of her life put her in the 80s. And I'm like, okay, this is a chance to write about the AIDS epidemic, which is something I've written about before, just in short stories, something I've been interested in, you know, my whole life. It wasn't random, but it seemed at first like that might be a subplot. And even before I started writing, things had flipped and it became the main story. And in those early days, I'd imagined it's time to set something really deeply in Chicago. I feel like that's what I'm going to, you know, it's what I want to do next. As I realized that I was writing in so many ways away from my personal experience. I'm not a gay man. I was a kid in the 80s. I'm not HIV positive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Keeping in Chicago is like, I'm on home turf in this one way. I can talk about this intersection, and I know that these streets intersect. I can, like, you know, I know based on where he lives that he's a Cubs fan and not a Sox fan. This is the no-brainer part for me. And of course, I'm going to do tons of research, and I'm looking up maps of, you know, gay bars in 1986, all that. But I sort of doubled down on my instinct of like, yeah, I'm going to keep this one part of it. I'm going to keep this close to home. Then once I started trying to do my research, and I'm realizing how little is out there in book or film form about Chicago. Now, there are plenty of resources, but, you know, I'm going to the library, like, where are the 5 published books on AIDS in Chicago? It's not what you'd think it is, right? Yeah. And, you know, that was sort of like oh God, I'm going to have to do more work than I thought in this area. I thought I was keeping it close to home and this is going to be the easy part. Actually, still close to home, a lot of work involved. But that's another reason to, you know, for one thing, I don't want to tell the stories that have been told before, even if they haven't been told enough. You know, just as a writer, you don't want to be retreading old ground. You don't want it to be, oh, it's just like this other thing I already read, just on an artistic level. But then it's also, well, okay, what did happen here? Now I'm really curious because I know it happened here. you know, I remember some stuff, even though I was a kid, I absolutely know. And I'm finding oral archives online. I'm finding, you know, the beginnings of some trailheads. So what happened here? What's continuing to happen here? And it just became, I think, in choosing a character, for me, in choosing a character who was newer to Chicago and sort of newly infatuated with Chicago and what that meant for him, it allowed me to write about the city in a really kind of love letter way.
Mm-hmm. And it does. That's exactly the phrase that I was going to use. It is Chicago is a character in the book, as is Paris. Mm-hmm. But it is a love letter to Chicago, and it's a love letter to the gay community that was. I mean, every single character in this book, grabbed hold of you and held on to your heart. You know, even right near the end, you know, sort of like when we discover about Julian, and Julian survives, and, you know, he should be a cad. He should be somebody that we should think, this is a guy, I'm just going to dismiss him. But he is, every character in this book has so many redeeming features and is so redeemable and just grabs hold. They're friends. They become your friends.
That's, you know, that's what you feel like when you're writing, when things are going well, is, you know, I was a kid with imaginary friends. I wasn't an only child, but my only sibling is 10 years older. So basically I was an only child, right? And I'm alone in my room with the little like hand-me-down Playmobil figures that were so hand-me-down that they were like made of wood and the faces had come off, you know, like, but I was that kid. And I think constitutionally, not just because of circumstance. And writing is a way of continuing to commune with imaginary friends. You have these people who, when things are going well, become incredibly real to you. And it's one reason, you know, I'll try, because I'm working on another book right now that's quite different. I'll sit there and I'll get like, I'm not ready to write yet. I have to map it out. I have to map it out. I have to outline. I have to map it out. I finally give up and I start writing. And the characters are the one thing that just, they show up. They just kind of volunteer for duty and they're there. And then I'm going, okay, now I know what I'm doing. I just have to follow this person who I never planned on introducing into this story. Who the hell is this person? But here we go. And I'll say with this, you know, certain characters, Julian was someone who just showed up. Yeah. He was someone who I needed someone at that party to, you know, who's there. I hadn't planned on him in any way, but then he shows up, he puts his chin on Yale's shoulder, and then he's around, and he, you know, and Fiona too is like, you know, that initial scene and going, there must be one woman at this party. These guys are hard to keep track of. I'm going to throw one woman in there. And I end up giving her a third of the book. And it's just what happens when things are going well. And when they're not going well, you force the issue and you make that happen anyway. But when it is going well, it's sort of, it's not magic. It's like dreaming. You know, when you dream, you're not telling your brain what to do. Your brain is manufacturing this stuff, characters that are maybe based on real people, maybe not. They're coming in. It's something you do subconsciously.
Right. Oh, how wonderful. So then why Paris? Why not Paris? And that would be a perfectly fine response of why the hell not Paris, but why Paris?
Right. Okay, so the absolute initial impulse that I had for this book was that I wanted to write about an artist's model. So here's the story. I was visiting my agent who lives in New York. I was there for some other stuff. I was at her place in maybe 2014. And she asked me if I knew what my next book was going to be. And I just handed in a book. So I was like, no, I have no idea. And she goes, well, you're going to need to decide. And I wasn't even trying to think about it, but I left her place that day. And my cab drove past this woman who was just incredibly striking. Like young, 6 feet tall, shaved head, ebony skin, like cloth flowing off of her dramatically. And she just struck me as a model. She might not have been. but I'm starting to think in the cab about models and about what that would be like, not the current iteration of model, but 1920s, 19 teens, as a woman, for your art, when you didn't have a lot of resources to make your own art, when your art might be inspiring other artists, and what would that look like? And I'm thinking, this is the book I want to write. And I sat down, I made notes, and I was still editing previous books, and I need about a year to turn things around in my head. And this is the point where I'm going, I don't want to set it back then. I want to set it at the end of her life, looking back. I do the math. Okay, it's the 80s. So she's connected to the art world in some way. She's talking to an art guy. Okay, so this is going to be a two-hander. He's dealing with the AIDS epidemic. She's a member of this previous lost generation. And there's a parallel there that is really speaking to me, that I'm really into. And the initial idea that I had was I was going to have her be sitting home watching the news, and this painting would come up for auction somewhere. And there's all this debate about, is this from this artist or not? And she knows the truth because it's a painting of her. And so she needs to contact people in the art world, and she's going to start to tell her story this way. And so I'm thinking about this for months, and I'm getting ready to go to an artist's residency to finally work on this. Like, you go for 2-3 weeks, you sit in a cabin and you write. And my husband asked me the day before I left what I was going to work on. And I told him this story about the woman watching the news, and there's this painting and blah, blah, blah. And he goes, honey, you know that's the plot of the movie Titanic?
I was going to say.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant.
I'm really glad he said something, right? I'm really glad that we had this conversation. But yeah, she's watching the news, and they pull up the sketch, and she's like, that's me. And then her stories. So that threw me for a loop. And this residency, and I'm sitting there going, what else do I have? But I had this interesting parallel, this sort of two lost generations, maybe speaking to each other in some way. And I was also starting to realize, just separately, if that this was more the story of the 80s, that she's more she's the subplot. She's kind of the voice that comes into this. But this is a story about the 80s, a story about Chicago. It's a story about the 80s. It's a story about AIDS. And so just, it was, it wasn't like I was full on going to write the Titanic and then I took a left turn, but it was a little nudge.
Wow. Wonderful. That subplot of going back to Nora in Paris, sort of like in the back of my mind, I always consider myself a little bit of a Gertrude Stein. Oh, I wish a lesbian woman living in Paris. Wouldn't that be?
With that scarf, you could totally, that's a very...
Right, don't you think I could do it? And so that is what it reminded me of. So Nora's character for me, and the group of artists that she hung out with, and maybe it's a little bit later than when Stein was in Paris, but that's what it reminded me of, that cafe culture of artists congregating. It's beautifully done. Absolutely.
Thank you.
I loved it. And especially I have a real fondness for Paris. As a matter of fact, I love the language. I love French. And then after I graduated from undergrad, I actually landed an English teaching assistantship in a high school just outside Paris. So I did get to be a lesbian in Paris, although in the years 2000 and 2001. So not a Gertrude Stein, but
Ellie, we need to go back. We need to go back. So if you had a favorite character, this is like asking a parent, who's your favorite child? Right?
It's easy. It's a better, easier question than that. Yeah.
Okay. So the character and the character development. Who's your favorite character, and what's your favorite character arc in this book?
Yeah. Here's what's funny. I can't say Yale because he's so close to me. Mm-hmm. And this is another way. I have a million differences between my life and Yale's, but there were ways I had of writing him close to me. I gave him asthma. I have asthma. I've been hospitalized with pneumonia. So like there were scenes that I could write with much greater authority, right? So just, you know, a few things like that. I teach at Northwestern, some things like that, right? So it's hard for me to then look at him and say him, because to me, it's almost like he's translucent, like he's my lens on the world, right? So I have to go with minor characters. And I would say I love Julian. Julian is absolutely the person that I would just be like thrilled to see at the bar, get tired of after 10 minutes, but then seek him out at the end of the night when I was drunk enough, you know, like,
yeah.
And be like, you understand me, you understand that guy. I also, so there are a few very minor characters. Dr. Cheng, who is not directly based on anyone, but there were certainly doctors that I spoke to in Chicago whose stories influenced him. And just, there was actually a moment, it wasn't from a doctor. I was speaking to this man who'd been an art therapist on the unit at Illinois Masonic, and he told me a story about watching a doctor compose himself before he went into a room. And that was like, okay, I've got it. That's Dr. Cheng for me. That's like, you know, he's going in there once again. Julian's mother, who we never see on the page, he talks about her for like 2 paragraphs. I love Julian's mother. He's sort of like, and I think as a writer, it's really fun to almost, you know, like this little capsule narrative of a certain person. How much can you get across in very few words? And there are characters who are fun to write because they're terrible. You know, there are people who, there are 3 people at least that I've been told you want to strangle, you know, like.
And Roman.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Charlie, Bill, and Roman. Yeah. And they're challenging in other ways because you have to write those characters. You have to get behind them fully in the way that an actor would need to. You know, an actor is playing an asshole in a movie. They have to believe that they're right. They have to get behind that character and see the world through that character's eyes. And you have to do that just in every line of dialogue that you're writing from every character. You have to be an actor for all these different people. And so there were some that were harder to get behind than others. Charlie was hard for me to really, really figure him out. Yeah. But, you know, just because it's harder doesn't mean you don't like them or get there or feel it.
Yeah. Wow. I would imagine that in order to do that, you have to have incredible empathy. Right? And I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about that. Do you think that through these really complex, layered characters, that do you feel that as a writer, and particularly in writing this book, that you felt that you already had the empathy to write these characters, or did you find that it developed your empathy?
That's such a good question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. It's a great question. I think it's absolutely both. You I think cannot even begin to approach fiction unless you have that capacity to paradigm shift and to see things from this other point of view. I don't know that I always had it. I'll say, like I said before, I'm sort of a quasi only child, and I think it came harder for me than someone. I remember my 1st grade teacher again and again and again, whatever arguments I was getting in, she would grab me by the arm. This is like something that would be totally illegal now, but like Indian burn my arm, which I'm probably not supposed to say that, like, but you know, on my arm, and say, you have to see things from other people's point of view. Wow. And it was like, okay, I you know, I guess it sunk in. She was gripping me so tightly that it did something to me. I don't know, but it sank in on some deep level, and or I matured, and or that was always in there, and whatever. But I think there are certain practices. Acting is one of them. I did act through high school and college. It's that practice of stepping into someone's skin. I think we can get there by reading. I really do. I think that's one of the main reasons that we read. I think we can get there you know, by being incredible listeners. I think there are many, many ways that you can experience as lives outside of your own. There are many ways to shut that out too, you know? But then in writing, you have this feedback loop, I think, where you know if a character is falling flat, if you're honest with yourself. And if you are, and speaking of the Paris in the 20s scene, what Hemingway said was, if you're going to write fiction, you have to have a foolproof bullshit detector. Yeah. And it is like, am I fudging this, or did I really, really get in there and do something? And you know when it's off. And if it's off, it's because there's something that you're missing. There's something about this person you don't know. So you do things like pages and pages of writing that are never going to make it into the book, just about this person and where they come from. I would do things, it sounds a little bit bananas, but I will go for walks as characters. Just like, I'm struggling with this character. I'm going to get my coffee, walk to the lake, and then walk back to my car. And I'm going to go on a walk as Fiona or whatever. Mm-hmm. And whether that's on a nowhere sidewalk, or whether it's, you know, when I was writing this, walking through Boys Town, and, you know, walking as someone in 1986, walking as someone in 2016 as I was writing, and going, how trippy would this be for this person who, you know, would be jumping here in time, right, to see what's going on.
That was a great point in the novel, where if Fiona brings Nico into 2015, and the things that he would see and the things that he would experience, it really would be mind blowing. It would be, you know, what is it? Star Trek come to life.
Yeah.
Yes. Star Trek come to life. Some of your characters, have you, so part of the reason I know Brian Hegelke is that he and I have worked on a few films together, very Chicago-centric films together. Has anyone approached you about turning this into a film?
So here's what's happening. Mm-hmm. It's not film, but we have sold the option for TV series. And it is Paper Kite Productions, which is Amy Poehler's production company. She's not going to turn it into a comedy, not worry. They did Russian Doll a few months ago. So, you know, they do drama too. And she really wanted a big drama. She, like every comedian ever, lived in Chicago for a few years and lived kind of in Lakeview-ish area in the early 90s. And I don't think, okay, so option is the first thing. After, the next step is we need to pitch this to HBO, Hulu, Showtime, Netflix, etc. And we're, you know, seeing it as like a 6 or 8 episode limited series, what they say. Now, they used to say mini-series, now we say limited. I don't know what changed. Mini-series sounds much like a minivan. Like, it sounds like, I honestly think that's what it is. It's like, oh, that's from the 80s and that's for moms. Limited series. And I think I'm not allowed to tell you who has gotten involved as a potential showrunner and producer, but I will say that anyone on this chat who knows who this person is would scream. It's someone really, really, really cool. So, someone and who also knows Chicago. Not Oprah. Like, let the wild speculation begin.
Oh my goodness.
A little bit. I'll say this: it's someone I told my husband, and he was like, "Who?" So,
God.
Okay, this call would freak out. So.
That is amazing.
So you never know.
Fantastic. I think that's wonderful. That threw me over the edge. I know.
Nabila, can you hear us? You're breaking up a little bit.
But you're frozen in the best pose.
I know.
It's like beautiful. I love it.
Your head is thrown back in laughter, and you have your fan up in the air. It's just that we can't hear you.
Oh dear. Well, she'll sort it out.
Yeah.
I'll say, you know, so much that gets optioned doesn't get made. And there's so many stories, you know, because Hollywood is like, something will happen where one person will drop out and then someone else will drop out. And then this thing, you know, I have a friend who, she finally got a book of hers made into a movie, but every previous book of hers had been optioned. And at one point, the farthest they got was that Halle Berry was on the airplane had boarded the plane and then got some call that someone had dropped out and blah, blah, blah. Halle Berry, because they're still at the gate, Halle Berry gets off the airplane and the movie never happens. So this is unlike, I mean, it makes the publishing industry look like risk management or something like that. It's such a wild, unpredictable industry. And you get money involved.
Well, big dough involved. Money,
then things happen. But there's some good energy behind it, some really exciting people behind it, and
oh, that's so exciting. Now I'm just curious, and I know that you probably can't talk too much about that, but in this limited series, is it's going to will it be similar to the book where it's 1985, 2015? There will be back and forth between the two different eras or time periods?
About it. I think they're definitely going to be included, whether or not it's back and forth or whether it's something, I think there are things fiction can do that film can't do, and there are things that film can do that fiction can't do. And I think there are possible, there might be options in sort of montage, in pastiche, like putting different things in different styles together. I think there's all kinds of stuff, and the people involved at this point are wildly creative, beyond what I would even think of. And so I think we'll be, I don't know, I'm excited. It's kind of, I think anytime there's a collaboration, there's just this incredible sense of seeing your work through different eyes. Even just if I'm listening to clips of the audio actor who did the reading of this is incredible. Or wow. You get to see the different covers come in for different translations. And that's a collaboration of a different sort. It's an artist's interpretation of what you've done. And it's all very cool to think about. If anyone, has magic spells, knows any good potions, that would be great.
So I do chant. I'm Buddhist, and so even though it's not a magic formula, I will be chanting, sending tons of good energy tonight when I do my evening chanting and prayers. So absolutely, and congratulations in advance. This is wonderful. However it winds up evolving, these stories and these characters are so incredibly profound and just also very moving, and just something that I was really touched by is, welcome back, Nabila. Something I was really touched by.
I got so excited I froze.
Okay. Just the friendship and sense of community, because it's not that this is exclusive to the LGBTQ community, but because of so much stigma and marginalization and people being disowned by family members, LGBTQ people have had to create their own families, which is why we often call each other family. Oh, is such and so family? I mean, and so that's something that really came through in the book, is this incredible sense of family that had nothing to do with biological relations, but that had to do with people who chose each other and people who loved each other and supported each other through thick and thin, and shared all kinds of moments, from getting drunk and laughter and the mundane details of life to end of life. And I have to say, that's something that really resonated with me greatly in this book.
Thank you. It was part of what came through to me about a city, about Chicago in specific, was the nature of the community here. Mm-hmm. That I think if I'd been writing about New York or San Francisco, there are in that moment, right? The LGBTQ communities in both are larger, also more spread out. Mm-hmm. And Chicago, quite a big community, but geographically centered in a really fundamental way. You get that in some other cities, but often cities with much smaller communities. I was in Fort Worth, Texas, with a poet friend of mine, and he wanted to see, he was like, I want to see the gay district, because I'm going to see because he was like, I'm on Grindr right now, and there's the nearest person is 70 miles away. I want to know what's up. It was an intersection with a bookstore, 2 gay bars diagonally, and a gas station. And that was the neighborhood, right? And so you see, and I'm sure there was more to it than that, but it was wow, this is geographic centrality in this really fundamental way. But you look at how that happened in Chicago, and I think there are unique circumstances in Chicago, having to do with everything from bar owners who really planted a foot in Boys Town and did not want things to move, to the way that that particular neighborhood gentrified exactly when it did, but not before it did, to, I mean, a million other things. And in that moment, there was this centrality geographically. And then you also have people coming here from neighboring states, from all over. This is not everyone was born in Chicago. This is, you know, people are from small towns, which I have, you know, that mix in the book too. I talked to one person who, one of the many people I interviewed, he was born downstate and he had been visiting Chicago on weekends. And then news comes out, it's like 1982, it's 1983, there's no testing, of course. And he's figuring, okay, I got it for sure. Why am I going to spend the rest of my life downstate? I'm going to move to Chicago. And I'm moving to Chicago knowing that that's probably it for me. I'm going to go there and have a good couple years, and I'm going there to die. He never had it. He never got it. He's still here. And he's become a pillar, I think, for a lot of people in the community. And he, you know, it was the sense of like, well, I could, you know, if I'm going to, I could die in whatever, Illinois, or I could die in Chicago. But this sense of Mecca, the sense of pilgrimage, the sense of a place that people were coming to in the same way the artists were coming to Paris in a previous generation from all over and then finding chosen family. It is not completely unique to Chicago, but there's a vibe there that I was able to tap into in the stories I heard about Chicago that I think would have been fundamentally different if I were writing about any other city.
Wow. That's amazing.
How did you, it's incredible. I felt that immediate connection with Chicago and community and family, and I have I have friends that moved here from other places that also there is something that draws us to Chicago, and it is that compact, the compact nature of it. Was there any one pivotal character that you interviewed first that then allowed you to, for want of a better word, infiltrate the rest?
Like a spy coming in. You know, really, so here's what happened. I started off knowing that I wanted to do as much foundational research as I could so that I would go in as informed as possible into any conversation. Because I don't want to take someone's time going, tell me what it was like. You know, I want to be able to say, okay, so I know you work for Chicago House. They were founded 1986, right? Like, tell me about whatever. And we're going to start with the ball already rolling. So before I ever talk to anyone, this is when I'm reading every back issue of the Windy City Times from its founding in 85 through 92. A lot of online oral archives that are available through, I can't remember if they're actually through the Windy City Times or if it was Tracy Bain putting them together, but one and the same, basically. The very limited coverage that the Trib had, you know, whatever I could find. And I started off, honestly, just reaching out on Facebook and saying, you know, here's what I'm doing. I have my characters, I have my story, I've done my, you know, my legwork, but I'm looking for people to talk to me about detail, about texture, and I'll buy you lunch, I'll buy you drinks, I'll buy you dinner. I won't, you know, make you talk about anything you don't want to talk about. I'm not going to steal your stories. I just want to talk. And people started introducing me to friends for the most part. And actually, I mean, the first few people I spoke to, they were great, but they were sort of, it was like someone who'd moved here in 92 and then done some work for ACT UP, but wasn't a lot older than I was. And, you know, but it was still a really helpful conversation. But what I did was at the end of every conversation, I was asking, who are the next 3 people you think I should talk to? And then people are brainstorming, and in some cases they were coming up with like, well, you should talk to, you know, Larry Kramer or whatever. Like, that's not going to happen. But in most cases, they were thinking of people they knew that they could email, introduce me to, they could vouch for me. And that was the way most of it happened. There was one moment, this was just the most random thing. I met another writer at a festival. And then I was doing a reading a few months later in Boulder, Colorado. And he came out for drinks afterwards with me and a couple other friends. And I mentioned what I was working on. And he said, oh, you know what, when we lived in Chicago, my wife was a neurosurgeon. And she knows these 2 doctors, David Moore and David Blatt, who started this AIDS unit at Illinois Masonic. And we're really good friends. And if you want me to write me an email, and I was like, I would like that very much. So that was probably the moment where, you know, I'm in their apartment multiple times. They're introducing me to people. I adore them both. That was like, okay. And if they're vouching for me to talk to someone, people trust me pretty at that point. The other funny one was that I went to, when they had the Art AIDS America exhibition at Alpha Wood Johnson, what was that, 2016, maybe 2015, whenever that was. And I went there and they were doing a showing of the documentary, the very short documentary film Short Fuse about Danny Sotomayor, one of the founders of ACT UP Chicago. And I'd been invited there by Lori Cannon, who is a great activist who I already knew. And they did a panel afterwards that was very much sort of remembrances of Danny from people who knew him. And there were 4 or 5 people up there. And as I was kind of just going to skulk out because it seemed like everyone in the room had a personal connection and I was not going to stick around too long. And I'm halfway at the door and one of the guys who was on the panel goes, Rebecca. And I'm very face blind but in my defense, he was wearing a hat and he'd grown a beard. But it was Owen Keenan, who's an incredible LGBTQ historian here. And I knew him as a bookseller because he works now at Unabridged Books, but he'd been working at the bookstall up in Winnetka, and I'd known him for years. And obviously not that well. Now I know him much better. I would have recognized him. But then he was just boundlessly helpful. This is a guy with photos of everything, a memory for everything, can tell you whatever you want to know, and just an absolute sweetheart. So it's just, there's a lot of sort of serendipity involved, but it's a lot of just knocking on every door politely and seeing what happens.
I think that was what was lovely at the end of the book, going through the thank yous at the end. And, we are small and mighty, our community here in Chicago. And, there are names that come up again and again. And, Tracy Bain is a pillar of our community and, sort of like just a total strength for all of us. And so that was also lovely to go back and see, okay, this lends this piece of research so much gravitas. Right, you've gone to Justin Hayward, you've gone to Tracy Bain, you've gone to all of these people that are, as I say, stalwarts and pillars of the community who knew what was happening from the ground up, and so it was lovely to read that.
And it shows in the book as well. It
does. It really does. You mentioned Larry. Oh, I think maybe. Kelly, sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, I was going to raise that because that was in the questions, and there are 2 questions in the Q&A about notable folks. So yes, go ahead about Larry Kramer and how that connects. Yes, and how the book connects with the pandemic. Go ahead, Nabila.
With the pandemic and with these luminaries that really. It took people like Larry Kramer to come out and to scream and yell and shout. And we've been talking a lot over the last 8 weeks. We've discussed a great deal about the fact that it takes activism, and it takes anger, and it takes passion, and it takes you have to be willing to pick up sticks and go out on the street. We're noticing it today in Minnesota. We're noticing it in Minneapolis. We're noticing it all over, unless and until you're willing to jump up on top of a car and scream and shout for the rights of your fellow brethren, nothing's gonna happen. So talk a little of sort of like Larry Kramer and people like him that influenced you, and what your feelings are this week about his passing, because my heart just broke a little bit more.
Yeah. Oh, I have like 72 things to say. I'll try not to say all of them, but
say them all. We've got.
Well, one thing that I'll say is that, as I've traveled with the book, my research just sort of inadvertently, but in a lovely way, has reached well beyond Chicago, where I'm reading, I was reading in Dubuque, Iowa, which you would not think would have this major AIDS story. And this guy at the back of my signing line, he said, he comes up and he was like waiting in the back, and I was like, oh God, he's gonna like say something angry or something. But he came up and he said, I was the infectious diseases specialist at one of the 2 hospitals here in Dubuque. And he said, if you were a young gay man in the 80s, you probably left and went to Chicago or Minneapolis, but when they got sick, they came home. And so he treated dozens of boys in a vacuum. And I asked him if he'd written any of this down. He said, no, I hadn't really thought about it. And like to so many people that I've met, saying, why don't you? Like this is really important history. And if ever there was a reminder that, the generation that was out there in the streets in the early days, the generation that is among our, oldest survivors, they're not going to be around forever. We need to record this history, and we need to learn. I mean, I was so privileged to learn from these people. I was writing this book from 2014 to 2017 as the election was going down and everything else. And it was like, in addition to writing a novel, I am here to learn from my elders, because what the fuck is going on, right? Like, let me sit at your feet. I also, in the April issue of Chicago Magazine, which of course is like no one's at their local Whole Foods buying Chicago Magazine anymore, but it's also online. I compiled an oral history of the 1990 ACT UP demonstration here in Chicago against national healthcare organizations and the AMA. Wow. It was the 30th anniversary on April 22nd, 23rd. And so they gave me like twice the space they were originally going to. It's like a lot of the April issue of Chicago Magazine. And I re-interviewed a lot of these people. I was talking to Laura Cannon, I was talking to Owen Keenan, I was talking to just like everyone that I could talk to, including like everyone from seasoned activists to a guy who was a college senior at Loyola, and he was in the closet, and it was the first protest he'd ever been to. Mm-hmm. And so many things were reinforced for me in researching that, in writing that. One of which was that there are so many different ways to be an activist. Because like you jump on the car, but also,
right?
Is it money? Is it letters? Is it, you're good on camera? Is it, yes. Exactly. Is it the way you live your life? Is it just being, is it being who you are? Is it whatever? So those things were incredible for me to hear again. It was also just incredible to learn, because this is, as anyone who's read the book knows, this is a scene that I wrote into The Great Believers. It's a pivotal scene, that 1990 demo. And it's one that I did significant research on in order to write it with some modicum of accuracy. I learned so much more now than I knew it then, which is good, because if I tried to write everything I knew, that would be like 70% of the book, and it would be a little bit unreadable. Like, why are we spending so long on the logistics of who has the signs in what trunk of what car? But the logistics of organization that go into something like that. A quote that I think didn't make it into the article was Jeff Edwards, great ACT UP guy, saying to me, organizing this was like doing a master's degree. in civic, in medicine, in civics, in everything. I felt like maybe not a master's degree, just writing the article was at least a BA for me. It was so much education. And the women, this is one thing that, I'm trying to get in there into some extent in the Great Believers without making it into like a textbook, but if I could go back. The women in ACT UP Chicago, this is what's different from almost any other city's ACT UP, is that the lesbians had so much more leeway, so much more sway in ACT UP in Chicago than in any other city. And it had to do with individuals. There are people like Jeannie Crocker, there are people like Sandra Johnson, there are people like Mary Patton, who they were basically, ACT UP Chicago came from some sort of veterans of the civil rights and Vietnam protest movements, like Ferd Egan, that's where he was coming from. And these people who had been around the block, men and women, who then, so they were kind of going, we are these gays and lesbians on the left, and formed some of the predecessors to ACT UP, like Dagmar, Dykes and Gay Men Against Reagan Repression, the right wing. There are like all these different things that
whatever the names were,
like everything that starts with R. There's that aspect to it. Then you have younger firebrands like Danny Sotomayor coming in, who became political with the AIDS crisis, and would say that, that in some cases they, Bill McMillan, one of the activists I was interviewing, said, I was never political until I got HIV. And you have those two groups coming together in Chicago ACT UP, whereas in other cities, it was mostly the latter. It was mostly young gay men full of ideas, full of energy, but you didn't have the slightly older lesbian component, these women who were putting their lives on the line. And this is what's incredible. When, the history of, in Chicago, elsewhere, the, younger gay men, lesbian women, not necessarily jiving on everything political, social. And they were taking incredible leadership roles in that protest, perhaps more than in might have been the height of that, but all across ACT UP in Chicago, all across gay activism, or grassroots organizations, in a way that just wasn't always true. And it made ACT UP Chicago, I think, a much more effective and mature organization. If only you have people, in some cases, just slightly older, people who aren't all 22 years old. There's a lot to be said for that, right? I love my 22-year-olds, but like...
Yeah. You're saying a lot of that had to do with people, number one, having a lot of life experience, but also having been, in terms of the Chicago ACT UP chapter, so a lot more life experience, a bit older, and having had the anti-war, the veterans, and the civil rights protest and organizing experience.
It's that, and it's also because I think we were seeing what we would now call intersectionality.
Yes.
You have, right, you don't have it's not just, people are understanding this isn't just gay men. This is women of color. This is the Puerto Rican community. Right. And if a single Puerto Rican mother has HIV, what happens to her family? This is not just this one slice. And ACT UP Chicago was better at that than so many other ACT UP organizations. I'm not talking other cities here, like as Chicago-hearted as I am, in turn, ACT UP Chicago is learning from Larry Kramer. So what happens with Larry Kramer is 1987 and 1988, they're doing these big displays of the Names Project quilt in DC. And along with that, ACT UP New York is there doing major actions. They're doing a major action at the FDA. I was going to say CDC, but the FDA. Danny Sotomayor goes there in 1988. Other Chicago activists had been there in 1987. They take part in these actions in DC. They're learning from Larry Kramer, from Peter Staley. Then they're coming home and first and foremost saying, let's change our name to ACT UP Chicago. Let's be part of this kind of broader network. And then also going, we need to get in front of cameras. We need humor. We need sound bites. We need direct action. We need to disrupt in a way that might not have been totally instinctive to Midwesterners, you know?
Right.
And
culture.
I think we're very nice people, and that sometimes gets in our way, right? But in a way that was incredibly effective.
Yep.
And it was magic, that combination of influence from the Larry Kramers of the world, the urgency of these young gay men who were imminently at risk, the wisdom then of this slightly older group of lesbians and of Vietnam and civil rights activists. There was just some alchemy there. And that's, I think, the apotheosis of that was this just about exactly 30 years ago, this protest downtown. There were plenty of other things that went incredibly well with ACT UP Chicago and with its offsprings, and with also just unrelated grassroots stuff, a bar that kept an envelope behind the bar with a slush fund for people who needed to pay rent. Organizations like Chicago House that sprang up, obviously independent of ACT UP, that were doing work early, fundraising early, doing, you know, getting things together before, say, the people of the North Shore decided that they were going to donate money because that was going to be the black tie event, making this happen. So I say this from the North Shore, where
no, I hear you. This is, I mean, and this is always the perennial issue, right? Is that it is at a grassroots level, and it is down home pennies and pounds that first start the movement before the movement becomes, you know, sort of classy enough or acceptable enough for everybody to join in and everybody to start wearing a red ribbon. But I have to say that I moved to Chicago in 1999. And I was, over the last...
It's not a Chicago accent, I was sure.
It's way south side, this accent.
Very south side.
I moved to Chicago by way of Lubbock and Austin, Texas, and then originally from England. And I'm a biochemist by training. And so in my, like HIV got characterized when I was in my undergrad biochemistry courses. And so this is what we learned it on the ground, and we marched. And I have to say that moving to Chicago in 99 and having there is a grit to Chicago. And if we talk about, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Or if any kind of activist movement, when it comes to Chicago, there are as you say, all of these intersections that come to play. Yeah. And right now, I mean, with Chicago House, what we are doing is you know, it was at one point AIDS, HIV, you know, sort of like, and how we deal with HIV was a very North Shore issue, a North Shore, and let's be very frank, and we've mentioned this over the last few weeks, that it was a North Shore white gay man issue. Yeah. Right? The fact of the matter is that AIDS and HIV is still incredibly problematic, and actually Fiona mentions it in the book, where she says something along the lines of, oh, you know, I've only got one crisis in me, or one charitable group that I can support. And, you know, she's not giving as much to the AIDS crisis in Africa, right? Which is what she says in the book. But, you know, we don't have to go as far as Africa, right? We just have to go south and west, which is what we are, as Chicago House, are doing.
Yes.
And north, south, west side. And that is something that Chicago has had throughout, all along, is those intersections. And maybe it is to do with the fact that we are that much more compact of a community, and we can see the different communities. Yeah. Those intersections boil up to the surface super fast.
You know what else too? Oh, go ahead, Rebecca. Please, you go first.
It's ironic because we are such a segregated city. And yet I think there is, you know, maybe it's just a matter of who's paying attention. Maybe it's a matter of there being at least some places, some communities where there's more intersectionality. But yeah, I mean, I think it's 20,000 with HIV in Chicago right now, about 17, 18, something like that. It's, you know, and it's interesting. I would have loved to spend like 7 chapters of just Fiona ranting about the state of HIV in the world right now.
Right.
And what I've ended up doing is it becomes, when I'm doing public speaking, which is, you know, now from my basement, but was quite a bit over the past couple of years from the road. You know, usually, very often I'll be in some city and they'll pair me with someone at the equivalent of a Chicago House, of a Vital Bridges, of a, you know, Howard Brown or whatever. And we're having that conversation about, okay, what is happening in Milwaukee right now? What is happening in Atlanta right now? And I still, I mean, I think I've met the most incredible people from the most incredible organizations. I still think there's something to the ongoing effort in Chicago that is special, and that I think is that sort of, we're just gonna dig in. Like, we're all just, you know, we're just gonna like sit here and do it, and it's not gonna be glamorous.
Yeah. You know what's interesting too is that both of you, I was going to bring up segregation really quickly and say that even though it's, you know, Chicago is such a segregated city, it makes me wonder if, in part, not that segregation is a good thing, but I wonder if in part that is why some of progressive, forward-thinking, you know, liberal organizing and activism is so powerful here, because we can't take it for granted that people are living next to each other and working alongside each other and intermarrying. It has to be very intentional, and it has to be very thoughtful and intersectional. We have to really work hard at it in order for that to happen. So I've always wondered that.
It's something, I would say that the research that I did for Chicago Magazine for that article would support that theory, that there was sort of an interesting reckoning that ACT UP continually had to do in Chicago with the fact that it was largely white, that it was largely young, that it was largely male-led. And there were enough people in there kind of poking at that and going, yeah, but you realize, like, look at the Puerto Rican community, look at what's happening on the South Side, look at what's happening at Cook County Hospital. And then going, yeah, no, wait, this is, and you couldn't just pat yourselves on the back and go, look how diverse this meeting is. We must be doing a great job. It was fairly obvious that what was lacking. So maybe there's something to that. Yeah, I don't know.
There is something to that. I know we've been going.
Is that?
Yes. Yeah. Oh God, I'm loving this conversation so much, and I do want to open it up to folks in the audience. And one of the questions that has come up, we're taking a step back, and actually this goes back to your interviews. Somebody has asked, are there plans for more books, or maybe an anthology with all of these untold stories that you've uncovered, you know, sort of like during your interviews?
It's a great question. I keep getting asked if I'm going to do something with, say, the recordings that I made when I was interviewing people, and I really can't, because part of the deal there was, this is, you know, into my brain and no one else's. This is off the record. You can say whatever you want to say. So I'm not going to be, say, transcribing those and donating them or anything like that. But you know, as I was just talking about with that Chicago Magazine piece, and then with my continued, hopefully, artistic involvement in a television series, if we're lucky enough that happens, this is not something that I'm going to move on from. I mean, I need to write another book, and my next book has nothing to do with this in topic, but I've been, you know, I was joking for a while that I was radicalized to the politics of 1987. Like, I know all my talking points for, like, against Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. But this is something, you know, the relative success of this book, you know, this book has certainly outsold all my other books combined. It has a much broader readership. And this is the year right now when it's being translated into other languages. So that's going on out there. This is a book I'll continue lecturing on. I'll continue speaking and writing about and talking about. So if nothing else, there's that. And there are events, you know, there are events like this. There are events related to other organizations in other cities that I'm going to continue to do. Whether or not I will, you know, do anything else in book form, I don't know. If there's a nonfiction thing out there that I might collaborate with someone on is a possibility. I'm not a nonfiction writer. And those are very specific skills in terms of documentation and all that stuff. But I could very easily see, you know, collaborating with someone and doing something, because it's, you know,
we're starving. We are like, as a community and as a society in Chicago, we are definitely starving for it, and need you to continue doing what you're doing. Eric Wilkerson asks, in conducting research and in your writing, what was the most emotional and or powerful thing that you learned? What was it that really, you know, if there's one thing that you can, you know, sort of like pinpoint?
Yeah. I will say, there were moments like the ones I'm telling you of someone describing a doctor kind of pulling himself together before he went into the hospital room. But honestly, there were a number of times that were incredibly meaningful for me where I was talking to someone and they were not able to finish the story they were telling me. You know, they were in the middle of telling me about a friend and they just kind of couldn't go on. And I didn't need them to. Because the thing, ultimately in that moment, it wasn't about details. It wasn't about, you know, what year someone moved from what apartment to some other. It was just sort of this osmosis that was going on with the emotional texture of the story. In terms of, you know, I think, you know, I don't know that there's any one story or fact that I feel comfortable sharing that I could point to. There are plenty of things people told me very, very privately that I, you know, even in fiction would disguise tremendously to put anything like that in there. But one of the most interesting things that happened, I'll tell you this, as I was talking to someone, he was telling me about a friend who had passed away. And this was before I had decided to write any modern sections to the book. I was really thinking it was going to be set in the 80s. We were sitting there talking, and he was talking about a friend he'd lost in the 80s who was in his 20s. And he stopped himself in the middle of the story and he said, you know, I feel really strange talking about him because when he died, we were very close, but we probably would have drifted apart. We were friends in our 20s. And I've gone on to have much more meaningful friendships since then. And so I feel completely unworthy of talking about him and sort of owning his legacy. And this was someone fairly prominent he was talking about. And then he said, but it is up to me because there was no one else he was closer with. And he said, I feel all this guilt about it. And it was such a complicated sentiment. And there were conversations like those were one of the reasons that I realized I did want this thinner thread, you know, shorter sections, but bringing it into the realm of memory, of survival, of sort of the long arm of guilt and grief, long-term survivor's guilt, all those things. But it was just the most complicated emotion, you know? And then he kept telling me the story, and we were just sitting there in a Dunkin' Donuts, and this had come out, and we went back to, you know, like Dunkin' Donuts on Broadway and in Edgewater, and we just went back to talking. But it was like, okay, that was kind of profound.
Yeah, that's amazing. I know that we've got, you may have seen that the screen popped up with various faces. All these lovely faces, right? Isn't it wonderful?
Beautiful. Hey, book lovers.
Hi, book clubbers. Maybe Dan Wessels, if you would like to. I'm looking to where Dan is on my screen, and I don't know if you want to ask your question or if you would like for me to ask it. Go ahead.
I can ask it. I was just curious, how has your life changed since releasing The Great Believers, both professionally and personally?
That's a great question. Like I said, it's been by far my most successful book. That doesn't mean like Stephen King level, whatever, it's continued, it's sold very, very well, but like wasn't on the New York Times bestseller list, but has had a long life, so it's like these weird measures, you can never tell, but by, I think, any standard, I've been really, really thrilled with how the book has done. There's the traction it's gotten, and then also the critical reception have been wonderful. I was already traveling a great deal for my previous books, but it was more hustle in the past. It was more like, I think I can get myself an invitation to this festival and crash on a friend's couch, and then I'll get the cheapest flight available and I'll switch planes 3 times kind of thing. And with this, it's switched to more like an invitation to be a keynote for a festival, and they'll actually put me up in an actual hotel, and going, okay, this is great. So I'm still on the road just as much. I'm still eating, this is until a couple months ago, obviously. I'm still living on airport food. I'm still missing my kids, etc. It's just like a happier vibe to it all, and in terms of the career stuff. And it's bought me a little bit of time on the next book. There's just that little bit of security that this one is supporting me in a way that not all books support their writers. And I continue. I teach writing. I do all kinds of other things too. But it's that sort of like, well, you can't possibly make a living in the arts until suddenly you kind of can. And it's, like, wow, okay, this is a thing. So there's that. I think that professionally, certainly just people might have heard my name now, which is it's within this limited circle of readers and booksellers and writers, and that's really nice. I think it changed me as a writer. I think that's the most fundamental thing. I think we were talking earlier about empathy, and I think that I certainly grew as a human, but I think that as a writer, that practice of empathy and this sort of deep dive into these characters in this book, I think that if I had an artistic breakthrough on this book, it was in the way I write character and the way that I feel character and the way that I need to really get behind every single person that I'm writing. And that's something that I'm hoping I can carry with me into my next book. As different as it's going to be, it's still, you hope to kind of accumulate some stuff, snowball some stuff along the way. I think that I feel a little bit more, maybe it's just how much the world has changed in the past few years too, but I definitely feel like a grown-up in a way that I didn't necessarily before. I'm never going to be grown up, but you know what I mean. A little bit more.
That's great. Thank you.
It's profound. Thank you for that response. It's a profound novel, and I really do. It bears reiterating that I think it is that certainly for Chicago, it's genre defining. I think it opens up. It opens up. There are so many stories to be told about and around Chicago, around this particular epidemic and this particular, the circumstances that surround it. And I mention every single episode, I've mentioned Little Jims. I think somebody needs to write about Little Jims. I really, really, truly do. And maybe it's going to have to be me, but it's do it. Little Jims. I don't know if there was I scrolled forward. Was there another question? Anybody? Michael, was that you?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in, Rebecca. Hi, I'm Michael Herman. I'm the current CEO at Chicago House. It's
be with you. I'm fascinated by the kind of the two time periods, and very much obviously in the AIDS crisis. I'm of that generation, obviously grew up as a gay man in the mid 80s. But I love the fact that, and just would like to know if you were conscious about this idea of in the 80s, parents and gay children, and that division and that losing children or pushing children away. And then that shift in the contemporary time of Fiona searching out her child who was also lost. I just found that, you know, me and my husband have been together for a lot of years. We have a 13-year-old boy. That was not something I really thought about in the 80s. And that family dynamic of parents and children kind of in reversal order. We see that whole dynamic of pushing children away because they were gay. And then see this mother searching out her child. I found that a fascinating piece in the story. I'm just curious perspective on how that came about in the story.
Thank you. It's really, you know, I think what we do as writers in terms of theme, which I would really say what that is that the idea of family versus chosen family, what do we owe to people we're related to? What do we owe to people we've made promises to but are not related to? Those are themes ultimately of the book. And despite whatever anyone's 10th grade English teacher told them, authors, I think usually, at least in this day and age, it might have been different with, you know, Russian symbolists or something, but I don't think our job is to find answers to those. I think our answer is to notice at some point what our themes are, and then to ask questions and to complicate those issues. And it was important to me that be complicated, that, you know, there were plenty of examples of parents pushing their kids away in the 80s. There were also examples of, say, Julian's mother or Charlie's mother doing the opposite. And there were examples of families that fell apart for completely different reasons. Yale's mother leaving had nothing to do with his sexuality. And that in 2015, there be examples of, you know, failed relationships, successful relationships. And what I'm trying to do is circle that issue and complicate it and ask questions about it. And if I come in with sort of a, you know, a moral or a message of chosen family equals good, nuclear family equals failure, or something like that, it wouldn't work. So, you know, as I decided that I needed this thinner thread of narrative in 2015, I was looking, you know, I didn't want it to be she's at an AIDS ball or something that was so directly on the nose of what I was writing about. But I was looking at what themes am I playing with? What am I working with? And parenthood and chosen family and given family. That was a big theme. And I realized it was something that I could do with, and I could also, you know, at the same time, be working on memory and survival and all of those things too, which were becoming so powerful for me in my interviews. So much a part of my way of thinking. It's also, you know, I'm a parent. I have, you know, wild, difficult, awesome children. And certainly it's probably the book in which I'm working through those, you know, those issues the most as well. But yeah.
Thanks.
I think someone else had a hand up before.
I think Anna. Oh yeah, Anna. Is that? Go ahead, Anna.
Hey.
I see someone. Okay, someone.
So my question was about
Anastasia had it.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Anna.
Okay. So Terrence had that insight in the book of, during the epidemic, how it was either a judgment on society and a judgment on yourself, and how people are kind of like processing all of this. And I was wondering if you were surprised by the relevance of your story now in our pandemic, because while I was reading it, I thought it was so eerie. There were so many crossovers and similarities about just like how people are processing this event, and if that surprised you, or if you've noticed any like spike in the readership.
There is an interesting, there's at least a spike in conversation. I think there's, right at the beginning, my book was on a lot of lists of like what to read in quarantine because of any parallels that people were seeing. What I've been saying, because I keep getting asked, you know, when I'm doing now radio or interviews or whatever, it's all like, is it the same? Is it different? And it's like, well, okay, like, we all remember that old compare and contrast thing that we were forced to do in high school. We're still capable of that, right? It doesn't have to be, yes, they're the same, or no, they're completely different. Like, we can look for overlaps, we can look for divergences. We can say like, yeah, there's some interesting similarities in the way that as soon as this epidemic settles on people of color, suddenly people aren't interested in covering it anymore. That's a really important thing to notice. We could also say, yeah, there's incredible difference in the way that HIV, being largely sexually transmitted, having to do with gay and lesbian and trans communities, has a stigma to it in and of itself that COVID doesn't. No one's saying, well, you got that because of your lifestyle choices, right? So all of those things are worth noting. Doctoral dissertations can be written on essentially comparing and contrasting any one aspect of these two pandemics. And I think it's, I mean, they're you know, there's a lot that we can learn from the ways they overlap, from the ways they don't. And I'm happy to be part of those conversations. I think that those conversations, when someone tries to fit something like that into a tweet, it doesn't go very well. Or when someone tries to say, you know, they're completely the same. No, they're completely different. That's just not very smart. The only thing that surprised me in the way people have talked about my book in the past few weeks is the people who've said, I read this, and they're usually not like, they're usually just like, I see it on Instagram or something because I look on the hashtag for my book. It's no one talking to me, but someone saying, I read this 6 months ago and I really loved it, but now I finally get it because now something like this is happening to people I know. Like, okay, I mean, sure, like, we'll take it, you know? And of course, I mean, people don't always get things in this, you know, maybe they mean something a little bit different by that than what it sounds like they mean. At least they read it to begin with, at least they connected on some level. But, and I get that you know, you might be experiencing something on a different level now if you're really experiencing fear and panic. You know, if you have siblings who work in healthcare and you're going, oh my God, this is what I was reading about. So whatever, but I'm thrilled that it's, you know, I'm thrilled that if anyone is using this as a time to look both back on the early days of the AIDS epidemic or to look at the ongoing AIDS pandemic and to go, oh my God, we are still losing 1 million people globally to AIDS a year. Maybe we should also be paying attention to that. I think those are all good things. So
yeah, it goes back to what you said very early on about empathy, or I think it was an issue that Kelly had brought up. That it is that it takes a trigger to funnel us or channel us back into a sense of empathy, and perhaps that is what is coming up is you know, sort of, first it was a novel for many people. For many of us, we lived it. For many of us, it was that we had friends that experienced it, friends that died from it, or friends that recovered from it, or friends that were working in research in, you know, sort of like into the drugs. But I do think that the parallels between the parallels and the disparate way in the two viruses were treated are sort of like shockingly obvious. And I think it's wonderful that we have this book as a reference point. I did want to, I know that, was it Sonal said that she wanted to raise her hand. She had a question, and I think Jason.
Devin had a question first.
Devin had a question, and then maybe Jason had a question.
Yeah, we had a question from one of our registrants going into this conversation. Do you think stories can be as effectively rendered from within a crisis as they can be from a distance?
Do I think stories can be told from within a crisis? Yeah, I mean, I think they're different stories. I think, speaking of Larry Kramer, you look at The Normal Heart, and that was sort of a cri de coeur of the moment. It was left unresolved. It was that rage that he was so good at channeling. Mm-hmm. Or you look actually at something like Not How to Survive a Plague, which I was just recommending to someone today. And The Band Played On by Randy Schultz, which I think we all know gets a lot wrong about patient zero, which was never a thing. He was writing it, he was HIV positive. It was 1987 when it was published. It was from the moment. It lacks the hindsight that I think, if he were still with us, I think he'd write a very different book today. But it has this immediacy to it. The way he was able to get just in the moment direct accounts, that minutiae, they're both incredibly valid. I think, since I teach writing quite a lot, I'm often talking to people who are writing memoirs. And with memoir, when it's really about the self, there is sometimes I'm giving people the advice that you need to wait and get some distance, because right now it seems like you're kind of just reacting, right? But there are other things, when we're chronicling history, when we're taking a more journalistic approach, or when we're recording what we're going through so that later we can look back, we can edit, we can take the long view. Those are all incredibly important. And I think that, once anyone gets old enough, anything is fundamentally about looking back. You're living through this now, but you also lived through the earliest days of AIDS in Chicago, say, using this as a way to write about that. That's a completely valid thing. I don't think there's ever a wrong time to write, right? It's never a bad day to write something down. It's never the wrong thing to chronicle. We need, as much as we do need these stories looking back on the earliest days of HIV/AIDS, we need stories about HIV/AIDS now, because I will tell you, having traveled around, and sometimes I'm talking to a really educated crowd and it's like this vibe. There are times when I'm talking to like the book club, country club ladies of Florida, and I am their author of the month. And these ladies read this book because I'm the author of the month. And they are lovely. They are very sweet. They buy books. But then I tell them that there is an ongoing AIDS crisis, and that was news to them. That is news. Where they're going, I'm throwing out these numbers and I'm like, yeah, we have, 1 million Americans living with HIV. And they're like, no.
How can that be? There was this story that I told on one of these sessions about a village in Pakistan where every single member of that village and every child born in that village, because they continue to have children, is HIV positive. Oh, right? I mean, it is and this is what happens with whether it's, particularly in epidemiology, it becomes a disease of ignorance, right? Absolutely. It becomes a disease of ignorance of the authorities of how to treat it, ignorance of the authorities of whether they want to treat it, and lack of education and lack of information of the victims.
Yeah.
Right.
And what happens with journalism, it is very hard to sell an editor on an ongoing story. Indeed. Right? Something changes, Kim Kardashian falls down and it's like, whoa, that's news. But there continue to be 1 million Americans living with HIV. Yep, they're still here. Is it's a harder sell. How are you going to put that on the front cover? And I mean, I think there are ways to do it, but it's very hard to do. And I think it might fall in cases like that to other media, to memoir, to fiction, to radio, to podcasting, to other venues, other stages, other megaphones that people might have. You know, this is not the month that the Chicago Tribune is going to put in a prominent place that we have 20,000 Chicagoans with HIV. It's not happening.
Yep.
So how else can we tell those stories? And there are people out there. I've been told 2 distinct times. I've been told several times that AIDS has been cured. Where like I'm at a party, like say like a book festival or something, and it's like some drunk white guy who has not read my book and is just like, so what do you write? And they hear what my book is about. And several times I've been told, isn't it great that we cured it? And then I'm like, oh, how much do you want me to bum you out right now? Like, how much fun were you having at this party? Can we go over here and sit down? But 2 distinct times I've started to explain that that's not the case. And 2 different times what I've gotten is, well, no, yeah, because Magic Johnson. Great point, dude. However, like not even a complete sentence. Yeah, Magic Johnson. That's the level of ignorance that is out there. Mm-hmm. And from people who are old enough to know better, you know, I understand when it's a 19-year-old and they're like, oh, I learned something about that in history class. I don't really know what's going on yet. Okay, I forgive you because you're young. It's time to learn. People who were aware at one point in time, theoretically, and are no longer aware. And that's, you know, those are people who, in some cases, would be involved if they knew. This is, you know, and this is the thing where it's like, I want to go back and put in, you know, 70 pages of information. What it's really going to be is that at some point I'll get to write a new afterword or a new foreword to this book, and I can hammer in some of this shit, you know.
It comes back again. I apologize for bringing it up again, but I think at some point in our society, with all of the qualifications that we look for in an interviewee, in a job candidate, etc., I think empathy is going to become a qualification, and it's going to become a currency. Yeah. So it comes back to that. So those educated people, or those people that should know better, it is that empathy gene. Is it turned on, and how far is it turned on? How far is it attenuated?
Higher humanities majors, man. Yeah.
Exactly. It's so important.
Yeah.
I think Sonal, you said you had a.
First of all, I wanted to thank you so much, Rebecca, for the grief processing that you've facilitated. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, how many people are crying at the end of this book, because that's quite a lot to take on as the creator of something, and to hold that, and what that process has been like for you, because grief is such a personal process. And I don't know how many people, but I know I watched some footage of a very, very close friend of mine that passed tragically, and got to really, it was very healing, very, very deep grieving. And it's crazy to feel like so connected to a piece of work and to you. And what is that like for you? And again, thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's really kind. Yeah, no, I've heard from a lot of people about crying on the L or crying in a restaurant or whatever. And it's like, okay, sorry, not sorry. I don't really know what to say. Like, yeah, I think obviously I was feeling a lot writing this. And it's always my hope that people will feel that too, hopefully in a cathartic way, hopefully in a light a fire under your ass way. I'm sure there's a better word for that, but I have quarantine brain. Not in a self-congratulatory way, which no one in this group, but what I don't want is like the lady from Winnetka who's like, I cried some tears, so I did my job. Okay, let's do something about it now. For me, writing it, I had this instant catharsis and outlet for what I was going through, because I'd have these intense conversations with people, and or I was living through some really intense experiences with my characters. That's, you know, anyone who's ever woken up screaming from a nightmare, you know how real your imagination can be. And that's the point you get to when you're really in it with your writing. You really feel that it's real. I had this instant outlet of being able to write this down, being able to, you know, to hear this story from someone and then go, okay, you know, I'm there on the human level. I became really close to almost everyone I spoke with. I'm hearing your story on one level, and on another level, I can go home tonight and the thing that you told me about how the floor of this one bar was sticky, I can use that. And I can also use this thing that I learned about pneumonia. I mean, whatever I'm feeling, I have a place to put it instantaneously. You know, the way that art therapy works is you're taking stuff and eventually channeling it into something, because that is healing. And I had that, like, this direct pipeline into my work. But, you know, it still tore me up. I felt, you know, I was, and then it continues. I mean, this is the thing about this particular book. Other books, you put them out there and the emails you get, or the people who come up to you at a reading are like, I want to be a writer. I really liked your work. This one is, I get emails that are, you know, sometimes some of them are, wow, I really admire your use of the paragraph. I really want to be a writer. But a lot of them are, I lost my brother. I lost my son. I had, you know, I am living with it. I blah, blah, blah. I had a woman come to one of my first readings. She was very elderly and she had an oxygen tank and she was with her daughter. And she came up at the end and she had lost her son and this was her daughter, and they wanted me to inscribe the book to his memory. And it was like, I mean, it was a lot. And this was like a week into the book, and that was, you know, there have been other things that have been, there's this category of emails that I get. Maybe one day in my life I'm going to write an essay about this. I get these emails about uncles. This is this really common thing of, usually it's okay. Sometimes it goes, I had an uncle. It's usually someone who was born in like 1980. And they're going, I had an uncle and I loved him. And he was my favorite person in the world. And he died of AIDS when I was 11. And my parents wouldn't talk about it. And I, you know, whatever it is that this book had, you know, helped me to have some insight. Sometimes it is, my parents loved him too, and we keep his memory. It's more often, he was my everything, he loved me, and he died, and I never really knew what happened. Mm-hmm. And this is like an inordinate number of emails along these lines. And then there's this subset of them that is still a significant number that is, and so I sat my parents down and I forced them to talk about it, or in several cases. And so I looked up his lover, and we're meeting in February, and like now we're in constant communication. Wow. It's mostly women. Mm-hmm. There have been a few men, but I think it's a lot. It's like, I think it's this category, sort of it's honestly like white suburban women, a little bit younger than me. And it was the gay uncle who had moved to Chicago in some cases, or had moved to San Francisco, had moved to New York, and lost, you know, and was excommunicated from the family somehow. And that's heavy for me. I mean, in the best way. It's heavy, and it's also, I'm soaring above the clouds, right? But like, that is, you know, as I'm sitting there writing this book, this is in no way is this in my mind that I'm going to in some way have anything to do with a reunion like that could possibly occur. And that's, you know, so for me, like, I'm never going to stop. Like, I never get to read my own book. That's one thing as an author, you can never read your own book. But on the other hand, I'm never going to stop reading this book because of the emails I got.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I actually have heard exactly that uncle story, but it is from an African-American friend of mine whose uncle who's from Detroit. And it was exactly that storyline of, you know, sort of why this man is always there for me every time I you know, sort of like push him to come to, whether it's an AIDS legal event or whether it's a Chicago House event or whatever, it is his in memoriam to his uncle. So that is a theme. That is a theme that stretches.
Well, and of course, we're talking about a time when it was very rare for gay men to have their own children. And as we know now, there's absolutely that paternal instinct. There's absolutely that love, and you're just going to give it to your niece, to your nephew. And that's, you know, and this is a family member who looks at you adoringly and without judgment, and who gets you, you know, in a profound way. And those relationships, I think, it's not just in the nieces or nephews' imagination. These relationships were profound.
And,
exactly. Yeah.
I know we've been going a while. It's been a minute. So I don't know if there were any other questions. I could carry on for the rest of the evening, provided I'm given an opportunity to top up my wine glass. I think Jason had a comment or a question. Yeah. Jason Hodges.
Yeah, I thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for joining us. I just first want to thank you for how well you captured the experience of these characters. I didn't live through Chicago in the 80s, but you know, you mentioned earlier tonight you talked to Dr. David Blatt. And by sheer coincidence, 18 years ago today, so May 28, 2002, David Blatt tested me positive in Chicago at Illinois Masonic. And this book captured what Yale and Charlie, that confrontation with Yale, Charlie and Teresa, when it all kind of comes crashing down. You really capture something that is very honest, very true. We were talking about people, Sanal was talking about people crying. Definitely, I cried then as well as at the end. Thank you for that. That's a huge thing that I think Sanal described it as like the grieving process. Like even just reading this book, I didn't realize I had more grieving to do, but I did. So thank you. A question for you though, and you know, you talk about hearing things from the audience is the author you handed over to us. I really enjoyed reading this in a group setting because several people whose faces I'm looking at here noticed things in the book that went right over my head. And I'm wondering if you as the author have noticed things from the audience, from the readers that went over your head while you were writing it, that you didn't even know were in the book.
Always. This happens constantly. So I was making the comparison earlier to dreaming and to that subconscious state. And, you know, things, I think when you get there in your writing into that subconscious zone, it happens that you write things in there that someone needs to point out later, in the same way that you need a friend or a shrink to interpret your dreams and to go, well, you dreamed about a train going in a tunnel, don't you? You know, there were several, honestly, this is, okay. So I was saying earlier about Amy Poehler's production company. One of the reasons I knew she was who I wanted to work with was that the first conversation we had, she's exactly like you think she is, but smarter. Like she's every character she plays, but then she's also brilliant. She was pointing things out to me thematically that I didn't realize about the book. She was pointing something out about this theme of testing, that there's like a theme of testing authenticity, testing, there's of course the HIV tests, but there's the testing of the authenticity of the art, and there's testing, you know, are these relationships authentic? Are they what they seem to be? And I had been completely unaware of that. And it's like, it's not like, oh, you're making that up, I didn't do that. It's like, oh yeah, of course I was doing that, and I had no idea. It was just a totally subconscious thing that was happening. of course, there are always the little things of like someone notices a typo and you're like, oh crap, that went over your head. But on the more profound level, it's very often thematics. There are also things that I think in certain cases have meant more to certain readers than they do to me. And one in particular, I am not a cat person. I am a dog person. I think cats are fine, but I have really bad asthma and I can't be around them and they're just not my jam. And I put Roscoe the cat in large part because there's just this incredible conundrum about, first of all, what you do with pets, but also this issue with cat litter and and infection and all this stuff. And I'm like, hey, someone should have a cat because this is really, there's something here. And the cat turned into a thing. That final scene where the cat gets brought into the hospital had partly to do with Dr. Blatt and Dr. Moore telling me that they used to allow animals up there. And I was like, all right, then I'm writing that straight in. But it wasn't for me, an emotional apex with Yale seeing the cat. Apparently for people who are really, really cat people, that is like the complete climax of the book. Like that's they're like, I was fine until the final cat scene. And for me, it was like, oh, it's a nice moment, but it wasn't a thing for me. So I thought that was kind of wild. There's certain people who are like, the cat. And I was like, okay, cool.
It was moving. It was touching. Very touching.
Yeah. I mean, I meant that. I meant for that to be the case, but in my head, it was not like the apex of the novel, which apparently for some people, it's all about the cat.
and the very idea that Roscoe was just sitting there, just waiting for somebody to pack to the house.
Well, here's what happened, and perhaps this is because I'm not a cat person. I had forgotten about Roscoe. I was basically, I had introduced this issue of the cat, and okay, Terrence has Nico's cat and blah, blah, blah. And I'm writing, and it's probably a year later at this point that I'm writing, and I'm going, oh crap, I forgot about the cat. And then I'm going, okay, if I forgot about the cat, odds are perhaps the reader has, and odds are these characters have forgotten about the cat too. And this is something that I should go with. Because real life, and then of course I had to make sure the cat was okay. I was not gonna, on top of everything else.
No, it was a kick in the gut. It was a kick in the gut when they go back in looking for the cat and it's been, sort of like hiding, and that to me was a real, as I say, it was a powerful moment. It was a powerful moment in incalculable and innumerable powerful moments in this book. I mean, honestly, Rebecca, it is a book that I will give again and again, and I will read again and again and again. Devon says for him, it was Yale dreaming of the polar bears at the very end.
Well, here's the thing. Listen, those polar bears took more research than almost anything else. It was bananas. As much research as I did on everything else, I didn't want, you make this different commitment to realism with every project, right? And I could have, for instance, set this in an imaginary city, or I could have had it in Chicago, but I'm making up the bars. And and as you saw, if you read the acknowledgements, I'm very specific about, I invented these 5 things, but only those. So I didn't want to write about the Windy City Times. So I made up a newspaper. But I wanted, I had this zoo scene. I wanted there to be this planting the seed with these polar bears. I thought of penguins for a second, and then I was like, no, I'm published by Penguin, and people are going to think I'm doing something to suck up to Penguin. So that cannot be it. It's going to be polar bears. And then comes the question of, were there indeed polar bears at the Lincoln Park Zoo in 1986? And then where were they? And it took a really long time. I had a research assistant who was looking into it. I finally managed, there was some article, I finally just Googled the right thing, and I found a great article about the polar bears, and I knew way more than I ever needed to know, because those were their actual names, Thor and whatever, those were the polar bears. But it was kind of hilarious, this research assistant who'd signed on to help me with this like novel, and I'm like, I need a map of the polar bears. Not from 1987, from 1986. After I'd made him make me a map of every gay bar in Chicago in 1986.
Well, Rebecca, I have to say that's an example of another thing that I have to say just really impressed me in terms of the book is your level of detail. And it doesn't come across as being forced, or it doesn't seem like you put painstaking effort into it, but it's clear that you did think a lot about the detail, but it's so interwoven in the characters and the stories, and everything makes sense. Like the details make sense, right? Why there would be polar bear. I mean, everything just has a rhyme or reason. But I was just really impressed by the level of detail. It's just incredible. It's just such exquisite writing.
It like I was saying earlier, there's this commitment to realism, right? And to the extent that that decision was easy for me, having committed to Chicago, to then say, if I'm going to write about this, I'm writing about lived history. We've had so many really important conversations in the arts in the past few years about appropriation, about who can tell what story. Those were very much on my mind in a helpful way. This is not a limiting or prohibiting thing. This is responsibility. It made the book better in infinite ways. It made me a more responsible writer. We need those conversations. We don't need them to intimidate anyone out of trying anything necessarily, but I had a healthy sense of terror as I was writing this. If I'm going to do this, I have to get it right, and I have to get it right on a granular level. I got to say the right bar. I got to have the right band playing. I don't want that moment where someone who was there looks at it and is like, oh, okay, well, this is fiction. Even though we know it's fiction, right? We have that one jump, that suspension of disbelief, but then within that, I was reading, it was something, I used to be an elementary teacher in another life, and I was reading some kid's book to my class, and it was supposed to be set in Chicago, and someone talks about the glittering waters of Lake Huron. It was like, oh God. And then the kids in the class thought it was hilarious too. And I was like, let's talk about the editing process. Let's turn this into a moment. But even on a much smaller level, you don't want that. You don't want the I'm talking about the bistro being there in 1986, and people are like, the bistro was not there in 1986. Or these people would never have gone to that bar, or whatever it is. And a lot of that was just casting a net, reading everything I could, talking to people. In those interviews, I did go in with questions, but so much of it was just, please talk.
Yeah.
When did you move to Chicago? What was it like? Where did you go? So a story I'm always telling on myself is that in an early draft, chapter 3, which is Yale's second chapter, and he's looking for his friends. He's going down Halstead looking for his friends. And I had him looking in the windows of various gay bars for his friends. Not a thing that you could do in 1985, right? And it was sitting across from someone having a conversation. He mentioned, he's just rambling on about the bar scene and talking about the windows being curtained off or painted black. And I'm going, of course they were, and jotting it down, not saying anything out loud so he didn't think I was dumb, but going, that would have been, it seems like a little detail. At the same time, that speaks volumes to what that neighborhood is and was, where acceptance was, where visibility was, where safety was in 1985. And misrepresenting that would be doing a disservice to the lived history. So there was a lot of that casting a wide net. And then also a big step in all of this was getting a few readers at the end, people I really trusted, who really knew what they were talking about, like Owen Keenan, for instance, to read the manuscript before it went to my editor with a fine-tooth comb. And I said, what I said was, it's not just, details, it's just anything that sounds wrong. We wouldn't have said that. You're missing this. And those, fortunately, I'd done enough work by then that it wasn't, constant, but there were a few things. And that was just as important, that no, we would not have been listening to Donna Summer that year because we were mad at Donna Summer. Those are important things, right? So
there were a couple of things that came up from that. So the format of this book club over the last number of weeks has been that we've actually had guest speakers on. Sort of like people that we've either introduced to the book or that have read the book or that know, have a connection with Chicago, etc. And
this is why my ears have been burning once a week, right?
It may have been. But it's all been positive and everyone has loved it. But a couple of weeks back, we had Julio Rodriguez on, who was the founder of Amal. And what I didn't know was that Boys Town was before it became Boys Town. So before the time period when you got to it, it was Puerto Rican.
Yes, it was. Yep.
And that blew my mind.
Yeah.
That this arc of this history and that, so anyway,
it was, absolutely. And this is why, so by the time I'm writing, and I had to calibrate this very carefully, even when it could be called Boys Town. And this was I had this long email exchange with Tracy Bain where we're going back and forth. And she's finally like, just call it Boys Town. But, cause it was like, when was it called that by whom? And, et cetera. But the reason that rent was affordable, the reason that this was not the really lovely, pricey neighborhood we know today, but that was a place where, and this was this poor intern. I had him down at the property bureau, whatever the hell it is, like looking up. I wanted to make sure the house that Yale wants to buy, that he could have afforded it in that year. And he absolutely could have, because property prices, this was still a fairly marginal neighborhood. This was a place, a few bodegas spread around still, definitely gentrifying to the point that the Puerto Rican community had maybe been priced out or had moved elsewhere, but gay community absolutely still on the verge, not what we think of now. So I'll tell you, my dad, who passed away in January, he was born in 1935 in Budapest, Hungary. And he was a professor at UIC, as my mother was also. They were both linguistics professors. And he lived, my parents divorced forever, in the late 90s, early aughts, he lived in Edgewater, right at like 5600 North Sheridan, so like Sheridan and Bryn Mawr. And fairly liberal guy, UIC professor, right? But had, just couldn't fully paradigm shift, grew up in 1930s Hungary. As Edgewater started to turn gayer in the late 90s, early aughts, he became convinced that his property values were going to go down, because he was like, the neighborhood is going downhill. He's like, I don't mind, whatever, but the neighborhood is going downhill because every time we eat out, we see these gay couples. And I'm going, Dad, your property, no. Your property values are going to go up. The restaurants are going to get better. The shopping's going to get better. It's going to be safer, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, you don't know what you're talking about. You're so naive. You're so idealistic. And I was like, just trust it. Yeah. Couldn't paradigm shift to this idea that it wasn't like, his neighborhood wasn't being enveloped by blight in some way, as much as he was, you know, I mean, you know, UIC, right? He's got like all these, he's fine with it. He was just like, we got to sell now because my property values are going to go down. And he did sell, and he was at one of the few times I was able to tell him he was very, very wrong. But, you know, this is what we're talking about in terms of Boys Town at that time. It was, and at the time when I started hanging out in Boys Town, which was maybe 92, we just thought it was cool to go shopping, and we'd like meet up at Belmont and Halstead. We're like 14-year-old girls going to get get a second piercing in our ear or whatever the hell we thought we were doing. It was, and I know that I can see like some faces, and some faces are younger, and some faces maybe were around. It was, you know, not the place you think of now. It was on the edge, the earliest edge of gentrification. Yeah. And that's where, you know, I have those conversations in Paris in 2015, Fiona talking about Soup Walk, and people talking about, you know, like, there's a Walmart, there's a Starbucks, there's a whatever. But for me, it was so important to walk around with photos and maps of Boys Town as it was at a very certain date, and be able to picture exactly what was there, and just sort of try to recreate it mentally.
Yeah, it's amazing. You know, I want to tell one anecdote as a thank you, and then I just want to ask others if they had any comments or questions. There's an amazing book of short stories called In Other Rooms, Other Wonders, which I will get a copy of.
Daniel Moinadine, yeah.
Daniel Moinadine. Oh God. Okay, so you know him, and you know those stories. And so this anecdote, I'm going to apologize for this anecdote. First of all, before telling this anecdote, because I tend to rush headlong because I am that fool. Daniel Moinadine, I love him to death. He is married to, this is for the benefit of the other folks. He is married to a beautiful Scandinavian woman.
She's a model, right? I think she was.
Oh my God, she is like right. And I am a little gnome of a Pakistani village girl. That's so I relate very much to his stories. I relate very deeply at a visceral level, particularly to his stories about the serving girls that came from the village, because that's essentially my ancestry. And so when I asked him, we invited him and we did a book club, and you know, it was out in the suburbs of Chicago, it was in Naperville. And I'm like, Danielle, how do you learn to write women so well? And he turned around. No, and I didn't say women, the women in your book. And the women in his book are all serving classes. And he is, I mean, that story, you know, that story is about him. That story is the upper echelons. So anyway, and he turns around and very glibly, he points to his wife and he's like, I get it all through my wife. And it made me so mad. It made me so mad, because there is no way that a Scandinavian model that is 6 foot, however, is going to know my story from Gujranwala village in Punjab in Pakistan. So I'm going to ask you the same question.
I'm terrible at Pakistani village girls.
I know village girls. How did you write the gay experience so well?
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's a really comment disguised as a question, so I really appreciate it. I don't know. I will say that I've had gay characters in all of my work, and I think it's partly just, and not necessarily central, sometimes on the side. I suppose, you know, it's a large percentage of my group of friends. I'm an artist in a major city. That's just going to happen, right? Mm-hmm. I think that for me, it is easier to write gay men than straight men for sure. I like straight men. I don't know what to do with them. They like scratch themselves and watch sports, and they like I like what goes on in your head? I don't know. I feel like gay men I have, for whatever reason, maybe more in common with, a better read on. I don't think what the advice, it more often comes up in my teaching. Students are asking how to write from a different point in the gender spectrum. Men, particularly what happens is men trying to figure out how to write women. And they overthink it. They think that in order to do this, they have to just write as if it's from another species. Just, like completely different things. And so their women are always looking in the mirror at their breasts and things. And you're like, no, it's not a thing. And they're just trying so hard that it falls flat. And the advice I'm always giving them on not just on gender is just, you write yourself ultimately, as you do with any character. And then circumstance, there are different circumstances. So if you are a straight man and you're writing a woman in the workplace, that's going to be a different experience. It's going to be different surroundings. You're going to have different insecurities, but there's some part of yourself, the part of yourself that didn't fit in second grade, the part of yourself that felt, were you ever in a situation where everyone was physically larger than you? Whatever it is, you can tap into that and you can get there. And I think that it's someone saying in the comments, it brings us to empathy. That's absolutely what it is. It's, I don't think that there's any tremendously greater difference in soul, whatever that means, in mindset, in thought, demographically between people than there is, I think it's a greater leap to think about differences in people's occupation, differences in people's socioeconomic circumstances, differences in just, circumstances of history and family and time and luck. I find that it's much easier for me to write characters who are involved in the arts in some way. I have a bit of a harder time writing people with like jobs, where like, okay, I've been a teacher and I've been a writer. And anything in that spectrum I can deal with. My first novel was about a children's librarian. That's in the spectrum. My second novel is about an artist's colony. Totally at home there. Yale's a money guy, but in the art world. Like, I can do that. I can do journalists in this one. I can do, those leaps of like, what is life like when you are a business tycoon? That would be harder for me because circumstances are so different. So I don't know. I mean, my other answer is I was a gay man in a previous life.
There you go. That'll do it.
I don't know.
We've been going for over 2 hours.
Rebecca? It's because I kept my bottle of wine right here the whole time. So I don't know about you. I gamed well.
Me too. I actually had to call up for more. I did actually text my friend who is staying with me and say, please, can I have some more? Please. And so I've topped up, so I'm perfectly happy. But I don't know if I don't know, Teresa, anybody, were there any other, anybody else that wanted to chime in before? Anna is raising her hand. And I think Chris is raising his hand. Anna?
Oh, one more thing is that I thought it was cute that Fiona and Cecilia were like grandmothers together because of how Kurt kind of like made a surprise comeback. And I was wondering, like, do you think Chicago are we like special how we all know each other, or is it just kind of like any city is like?
Yes, of course we're special. Look at us.
This is funny. Okay, so I have a friend who he lived in Chicago for like 3 years, in between living in New York and LA, and he's one of my closest friends. So I was one of the people I think he ventured out with the most in Chicago. And he became convinced that I was the most popular person in this city because everywhere we went, we ran into people I knew. And I was like, it's really not me. Like, it's really just like, it's a certain neighborhoods. Cause like, if I walk around Andersonville or whatever, like, I just kind of know everybody. He's convinced that I know everyone in the world and that I'm super popular. And I was like, well, let's just go with that. That sounds great.
Socialite.
I mean, there's a sort of theory of, there's this sense that I think Aristotle talked about even, of economy of character, that when you bring a character back in and use them in a different way, there's something very satisfying about that. I also grew up watching As the World Turns with my mother every summer vacation and school breaks. So it was definitely a tenet of soap operas of the 1980s and 90s. People just reappear. I put an excuse in there of how, okay, they met through Fiona, this makes sense. But it was fun to bring her back. And part of me wanted to put this wonderful happy ending on everything of like, they're just going to move to Paris together and be grannies in Paris. And the sequel is going to be called Grannies in Paris. But I wanted to kind of leave that door open. We don't know, but that there, life goes on. I fundamentally, sadly disagree with the closing line of Angels in America, which is the world only spins forward. But I do think that the world does spin forward. I just don't think that it only spins forward. Mm-hmm. And I wanted this sense of future, and that was what I was hoping for there. So, yeah.
It's beautiful. We did in previous discussions kind of relate back to other literature, other forms of art, and Angels in America did come up. And
absolutely.
God, this has been a complete privilege. And honestly, again, through my friends Brian and Jan Hegelke, or whether it's through Susan, you and I are going to reconnect on so many different levels. That is a promise. That's a promise on my part, and a hope and a wish that you will reconnect back.
I'll see you on the street in Andersonville or something.
I hope so. I really, really hope so. Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this.
Such an honor.
Thank you so much for chronicling a part of our lives and for seeing us.
Yes.
Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for seeing my friends. It's been such a privilege. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it to Kelly, and then and book clubbers, we will send you further details of anything else. Well, we'll send you a review and sort of other books that we will be following up on. So hope to see you guys soon. Love you guys.
Absolutely. And I just want to echo, I don't have much else to add other than to say this was just a pure delight, Rebecca, to have you join us. Thank you so much for sharing your insight, your experiences, your passions. And you are just hysterical. I love it. You have a great sense of humor, and you seem like someone who'd be fun to have dinner with. So
there was a time when I used to have dinner with people. Do you remember that?
Oh my God.
It was amazing.
I know. I love it. I love dinner combos. But I want to thank you so much again for writing this beautiful book, for being with us. And I want to thank also our fellow book clubbers also. It's been so much fun to discuss this book together. And someone asked, hey, is this the end of the book club? It is not the end of the book club. We'll probably take a month hiatus between each book just to be able to recalibrate a little bit and decide what the next book will be. But this is going to be an ongoing series. So please stay tuned, don't fret. There will be more book clubs to come. So book club discussions, so don't fret.
Thank you all so much. And you guys know Chicago House was not as prevalent in the book as it was in my research, but it was absolutely something that I was, one of those reasons I'm proud of Chicago and Chicago's response, and something I talk about when I talk about Chicago's response. So just a complete honor to speak with all of you in whatever connection you have, whether it's just virtual or whether you've done work there. Completely an honor. And I hope I see you all on the other side when we're all able to.
Thank you.
And stuff.
Be blessed. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.